what is dispensationalism? Well, first, obviously, you can probably see the word dispensation in there, right? What is a dispensation? According to Cyrus I. Schofield, a dispensation is a period of time during which man is tested in respect of obedience to some specific revelation of the Word of God. All right. And I should say that if you want to know kind of the division of what churches fall under these umbrellas, I can't give you a complete list. Dispensationalism is generally the preferred view of most of your modern non-denominational churches. Okay. So dispensationalism basically looks at God's redemptive plan, his whole plan for redemption, and says the way he went about bringing this about is through a series of dispensations. And think of dispensations as almost a period of time. And in each period of time, he sets up some kind of test for his people. His people fail that test. And then he enacts a judgment for their failure. And then after that judgment, we start a new dispensation where there's a new test, followed by a new failure, followed by a new judgment. All right. And supposedly we can divide up the entire plan of redemption into different dispensations. Norman Geisler, the late Norman Geisler, described it this way. He said, in each age or period, from Adam through Christ's return, God orchestrates a different condition with a different test to see whether human beings will obey him. Each time they fail. I know, shocker, right? Under almost every conceivable condition. The sum total of the dispensational examinations demonstrates that it is always wrong to disobey God, and that complete obedience to him is the only true path to eternal satisfaction. And here's a key difference between dispensationalism and covenant theology, and it's what's said here at the bottom of the screen here by Louis Berkhoff. Every dispensation has a character of its own and is so distinct that it cannot be commingled with any of the others. In other words, there's no overlap between them. You have this dispensation, it stops. And then we start the next dispensation, which is a whole separate shenanigans, whatever, okay? That was not a good word to choose there, but okay. All right. So, generally speaking, and again, I'm speaking in summary here because there's obviously differences of opinion throughout the Christian church, but generally speaking, scholars will point to 7 different dispensations in the Bible. Not everybody agrees with all 7 of these, all right? But this is kind of the most, I guess, and this is kind of the more popular view. I think most dispensationalists would point to these 7 dispensations. I will say in all fairness, and you'll see as we go through here, I'm not a dispensationalist, so if somebody out there is, correct me, that's fine. I have no problem with that. The first dispensation is what is commonly referred to as the dispensation of probation. And this runs from creation through the fall of Adam and Eve. The setup here is, would Adam and Eve obey God even when they didn't even know good from evil? So can we basically withhold knowledge of good and evil from people and see if they don't have that knowledge, will they obey? And we know how that turned out, right? They didn't. They still disobeyed. And so God punished them with the curses that were involved. He kicked them out of the Garden of Eden, and then we had the curses from the fall. You see the pattern. So there's, God sets up a situation to see if humanity will obey. Humanity doesn't obey, and then there's punishment. So then after the fall, we move to the second dispensation, which is the dispensation of conscience. And this runs from the fall through Noah's flood. All right, so at this point, what God does is, okay, first time around, I tried just having you not even know the difference between good and evil. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a conscience that will tell you the difference between good and evil. And let's see if this makes a difference. Did it? Nope. Of course not. All right. So even with a conscience, people still disobeyed God to the point where he flooded the entire earth, right? And that's the judgment at the end of the second dispensation. The third dispensation then is the dispensation of human government. And this runs from the flood through the Tower of Babel. And so now what God says, okay, conscience alone didn't do it. So I'm going to give the people human governments. And those human governments are going to have the power of the sword to enforce obedience, so to speak, by the power of the sword and punishment. And so, will people now obey God when they have this new government thing added in there? Nope. Instead, what they did is they tried to use this government to kind of create their own kingdom in defiance of God, and hence the building the Tower of Babel. And so what did God do as judgment? He confounded their languages and he dispersed them. All right. That's the third dispensation. Fourth dispensation is called the dispensation of promise. And this runs from the Tower of Babel through the slavery in Egypt. At this point, God is now starting the process of choosing one nation through which he's going to bless all others. And so he gives Abraham the promised land, and he tells him to stay there. This is where I'm going to make you a great nation here in this promised land. But Abraham and his family, go down through the generation. They don't stay in the promised land, do they? Eventually, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and all this. And Joseph, where does Joseph end up? Joseph ends up as a leader in Egypt. And with the famine, he says, come on down here. And Abraham's descendants all go down to Egypt, leaving the promised land. And so-called dispensationalism says, because of that disobedience for leaving the promised land, God punishes them by putting them into slavery in Egypt. All right, allowing them to be taken into slavery in Egypt. I mean, this is the first one where I got to say that I have a bone to pick with that, because I think if you read the book of Exodus, I think it's reasonably clear that the move to Egypt from the promised land at the time of the famine was actually God's doing, and God had his hand in that. So it's hard for me to say that this is an example fitting the pattern of dispensationalism, where you have a setup and then disobedience and then punishment, because I don't see the move to Egypt as being an example of disobedience when God himself is the one that kind of led them down there. But so I do kind of take issue with the dispensation of promise, and as far as fitting this pattern. I think that one's a little forced, but we'll move on. Number 5, the dispensation of law. And this runs from the Exodus, all right, when they leave Egypt, up through the destruction of the temple in approximately 70 AD. All right. This is when God, of course, gives his law to the Israelites through Moses. So now they have this whole written law that they're supposed to follow, so they know exactly what God wants them to do. And do they obey when they have the law spelled out for them? Nope, of course not. Yet again, they slip into idolatry, they slip into immorality, and so God sends them into captivity. The kingdom, if you didn't know, the kingdom of Israel actually split into two, into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom got conquered by the Assyrians, and the southern kingdom later on got conquered by the Babylonians, and they were all sent into exile. All right, so that was God's judgment, except most dispensationalists, and again, if I'm wrong on this, please feel free to correct me, but my understanding is that that's not the end of the dispensation of law, because they go on to say that God also gave his Messiah during this dispensation. And his people, what did they do to his Messiah? They crucified him, right? And so the punishment for that disobedience was the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Again, like the last one, I think personally, this is a little bit forced. I don't think this quite fits the pattern that we see for the dispensationalism supposedly says everything should fall into. For one thing, we seem to have two different instances of disobedience and two different judgments, both of which were supposedly under the same dispensation, because these are both obviously during the period of the law. One where they were disobeying, and so then therefore God exiled the nation of Israel, and one where they crucified the Messiah, and therefore God destroyed the temple. So that's another one. I think this one doesn't really fit the pattern, in my view. All right. Then we get to dispensation number 6, the dispensation of grace, which runs from the cross through the tribulation. At this point, God offers his unmerited favor to people through the cross. And again, people reject him. All right. And this is the dispensation that we're currently living in, just so you know. Again, people obviously today are still rejecting the gospel, right? And so what's going to happen, the judgment coming at the end of this dispensation is, according to dispensationalists, going to be the 7-year Great Tribulation, which we'll talk about more next week. All right. And again, I don't think this quite fits the pattern because there's overlap here. If the dispensation of law ends with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, if that's the judgment, then that judgment occurs 40 years into the dispensation of grace. And there doesn't seem to be supposedly dispensations are distinct from each other and don't overlap, but here they clearly do. If you ignore the killing of the Messiah and the destruction of the temple and say the dispensation of law just ended with the exile to the Assyrians and the Babylonians, well, then you got a huge gap in between the dispensation of law and the dispensation of grace. So again, I don't quite think the Bible, the biblical history fits the pattern here. And then the last dispensation is the dispensation of the kingdom, which runs from the tribulation through the end of the millennium. And according to dispensationalists, Jesus is going to rule after the tribulation. Jesus will rule for a literal 1,000 years physically here on earth, not ruling from heaven like he does now, but he will come to earth and rule physically for 1,000 years. During which time, by the way, Satan will be bound. And so people won't be able to use the excuse, Satan made me do it. All right. And yet, at the end of this 1,000-year reign, people will still rebel. There will still be a great rebellion. And there will be punishment of fire from heaven coming down upon all unbelievers, all those who rebel against him. All right. This dispensation is based upon a particular interpretation of Revelation 20, which we will get into more tonight. All right. So that's how dispensationalism kind of looks at the history of God's redemptive plan.